Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. Monday, October 3rd, marks the 32nd anniversary of German unification. While many people on both sides of the former border between the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG, and the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, consider unification a success, Germany is still a divided country in many ways. We're joined today by two award-winning journalists who both come from the Free State of Saxony and who grew up behind the Iron Curtain. In some of their recent work, they've explored some of the divisions between East and West. And so I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Vladimir Balzer. He's a journalist and moderator at Deutschlandfunk Kultur. Vladimir, herzlich willkommen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And also joining us from the heart of Sachsen-Anhalt as she drives through the East is Anja Heyde. She's a well-known German television host and journalist. Anja, also, herzlich willkommen to you, and thank you so much for joining us from the car.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I hope the digital desert in East Germany is not so deserted.
Well, we hope that as well. But if we are disrupted, at least we've got Vladimir, and you can tune back in. And the digital infrastructure is maybe even a topic that we'll get into in the course of our conversation today. I sort of wanted to start by just setting the stage a little bit. You know, from what I've been reading, from what I've been seeing over the years, it certainly appears as if the living standard has risen in the East, that the brain drain from the East to the West has certainly slowed, maybe even been reversed. But here we are more than 3 decades after unification, and it's clear that economic growth in the East is still behind what it is in the West, that many Easterners are expressing their discontent by supporting more populist parties on the left and the right of the political spectrum. And so I thought maybe we could just start with a very broad, very general question. And I'd like to ask each of you the same question, which is, how united is Germany today, more than 30 years after unification? And Anja, why don't you sort of start with that, and then we'll bring Vladimir into the conversation.
Yeah, the most easy question first.
Always.
Yeah, it's a really general question, and I try to find some words. I think we're talking about the reasons why I think it isn't reunited as it maybe should be. I think we're talking about the reason in this session. But first, yes, we are united as a country, united politically and so on, and economically. But in the minds, it isn't really settled, especially in East Germany. The 30 years after the German unification, we have still strongly this division, or it's a Trennung.
A split. So it looks like
Speaking of which,
Anja has frozen.
Yeah.
So Vladimir,
technically separated.
Exactly, technically separated. But Anja was starting to talk about sort of that there's been some unity, but that there is still this split. Do you want to maybe continue with the idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is obviously, which is still a great thing to celebrate on the 3rd of October. Just maybe I start off a little bit on the personal side. So, it's just a Monday, but still it's a holiday in Germany. This has been the case since the 3rd of October has been established as the date when Germany was reunified. So maybe Anja will be joining us via telephone or something later on. Would be great to have her back. Anyway, and it's still, for me as somebody from the East, it's still an occasion actually to celebrate. Mm-hmm. Even though it's a more, like you could say, a more formal day. So many in the East maybe would celebrate more the 9th of November when the wall came down, which is, or the 9th of October when there's been this huge rally in Leipzig, in the city of Leipzig, south of Berlin, where you had hundreds of thousands of people who actually stood up for their rights, for their freedoms. And this was in 1989. But still, the 3rd of October is something to remind us that in those days, it was a very short period and a very short historical window where Germany and where Germany really, let's say, used the opportunity and used the occasion to reunite. I'm not so sure how it would have been a couple of years later, you know. So
I mean, that's
why,
very
yeah.
true. I mean, I think Vladimir, you know, it's really this period between almost September and November that a lot changed. I mean, there had been pressure building up, obviously, over the summer of 1989 and before that. But it really is quite incredible to think about the Montagsdemonstration starting in September, and then the fall of the wall coming about on November 9th.
Exactly. And that's why this 3rd of October for me is still a day to celebrate, because it's not actually a day to like celebrate unity in the sense of like unity as itself, but in a sense of celebrating this historical occasion, you know, which I'm still happy about, that it had been used, it had been profited from by politicians in those days. I was a very young person. I've been 15, 16 years of age, and I'm still grateful for that. You know, that's why there's no reason for me personally to think that there could have been another way of uniting, because as we see, like the current situation, political situation, and as we have now in Europe, imagine we would have had a situation like this in those days. Yeah. So it was totally different.
We'll undoubtedly come back to sort of the current situation, but I think you're making a very important point that we can celebrate on October 3rd, sort of the historic occasion, the historic event that happened through German unification. And yet I want to come back to what Anja was talking about there being, you know, certainly some unity, some Einheit in Germany, but there's still being a division in people's minds. And I, you know, certainly remember during the time when I lived in Germany, people talking about a Mauer im Kopf, right? That there was still a mental wall between East and West. And so I'd like to come back to you, Anja, a little bit to talk a little bit about how and why you see this sort of split between East and West in people's heads, particularly if, as Vladimir is talking about, we can all celebrate the positives of the anniversary. There has been some economic and social benefit to people in Germany, and yet, nevertheless, Germany has not grown together in quite the way that many people hoped and maybe even expected it would over 30 years ago.
That's the thing about the expectations. They don't always fulfill like you maybe imagined or you hoped they would be. And I think one of the reasons why it is so difficult about I don't know if I said the word alienation between East and West. There's some kind of alienation between thinking, and Stefan Mau is one of the famous sociologists.
Yeah, sociologist.
Born in Rostock in East Germany, and he described it as some kind of state who was pushed down politically and culturally, and many Germans still see it that way to today. And you don't have to. It was so many had the feeling that the West had taken over the East. You don't have to share this idea. I don't share it, but that's a kind of discourse that is still maintained till today.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's almost the feeling about politically and cultural hegemony from West Germany, because when the war came down, as Vladimir said, it was some kind of slot where people really hoped now there comes freedom, there comes healthy, and what came was first Arbeitslosigkeit, so
Unemployment.
more than, I think, unemployment, correct me, but I think it was 3 million people in East Germany who lost their jobs in the first years. And they lost this kind of empowerment they had in this moment from 1989, when they had the feeling we are able to create something new, or we get this new life, this new lifestyle. And they don't only lost their jobs, they also lost their lives. I don't know how to describe it. Very happy. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, because you have this. If I understand you right, because we have been, I mean, Anja and me have been talking about this a lot in the last couple of years. You know, about because we very often actually call each other and try to exchange about the political situation in the East, because we both have this biography and we both share, you know, this personal experience, even though we have been like teenagers at that time. But still, you know, we can think understand. The thing is, that's why I mentioned this 3rd of October. This is like state unity. This is just state unity, you know, which is great. Which was, speaking of the international political scene at that time, was great to have. But at the same time, many politicians thought, well, okay, we have state unity, that's it. You know, we don't have to discuss anything beyond that. You know? But this was extremely fast. I mean, imagine, we are speaking of the fall of the wall in November '89, and state unity 11 months later. This is an incredible short period of time. And many people in the East, especially the generation of our parents, no, Anja, who are now around 70, 80 years of age, who had been around 40, 50, something in the middle of their careers, were confronted by a totally different economical system, and totally different laws, totally different kind of society. Yeah, and totally different political situation from 1 month to the other. And they weren't given any time actually to adapt, you know, like as, you know, speaking of democracy, speaking of the political situation, it was sometimes you could actually see it as a almost kind of, I don't know, almost bureaucratic way of uniting both parts and not regarding everything else which was there, you know. Not only speaking of losing jobs, but also of speaking of their biographies, of accepting their biographies, of accepting their lives in the East, you know, which weren't all bad. And this was a kind of atmosphere in the 90s where there wasn't much, you know, there wasn't like the public discourse wasn't really ready for this. You know, they didn't take very much care of that.
But let me sort of push you both on that a little bit, because certainly from my experience, living in Germany in the mid-90s and traveling pretty extensively to the new Bundesländer, to each of the state capitals and some of the major cities in Eastern Germany, it was clear in the mid-90s that there were people who got lost, right? People in their 50s, in their 40s, in their 30s, even in their 20s, who found no Anschluss, right? Who didn't have a future because of the changes that you're describing, Vladimir. There were obviously other people who were able to shift and take advantage of the new situation, and this created opportunities for them. And they were able to be successful. And I think, you know, Vladimir, you made a very important point that this massive change happened in less than a year and was really a shock to the system, and it was very hard for people to adapt. But here we are more than 30 years later, and yet it seems as if some of these divisions that Anja started to talk about are really still there, and that they're still pretty deep. And so I'm curious, if either of you have any thoughts on why today, 32 years later, people feel so left behind still, or what the origin is of the personal narrative that people have that has kept the mental division, if you will, even if there are other efforts to bring the country together.
Yes, what Vladi described as some kind of a specific East German experience. You've got, everything what came after the war came down, which hit many East Germans harder than the West Germans. Unemployment, Hartz IV, the low wage sector, lower pensions. And the point is, we have no influence anymore till today. That's what they feel. You've got a lot of universities. They hadn't, long time, no university in East Germany had a East German director. No, not one, not only one. The political system, and for a long time, I don't know the numbers, but I think 60% or so were West Germans in politics and East politics, and also in the university sector. And we lost the influence we were used to have, and they were overwhelming system, and we hadn't any chance to find our position in this new system. And that that's till today in some sectors.
Yeah, I could actually take up on that, because it's one of the, actually it is one of the most important parts of telling the story, is what happened to the elites, to the East German elites in the 90s. And we are not speaking of people who were involved into the political system. Where, there were many who actually weren't really, let's say, politically really qualified for still being part of the elites. But we're speaking of scientists, we're speaking of leading people in the industry, we're speaking of whatever, in the cultural scene and so on, that many in the 90s really lost track and weren't as asked anymore, even though they weren't really part of the East German dictatorship or something. So, I remember when I studied at the University of Leipzig for a couple of years, this was beginning in '93, that there was really a huge discussion going on about professors from the West who more or less took over this university, who were seen as people, let's say, in the second row from the West, who didn't have enough opportunities in the West, and then came over to the East. And just because they came from the West, this was actually, that's just the case. it was easier for them to follow a career in the East. And
that was an argument that was leveled on positions in state and city governments as well, not just in universities, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
there were some wonderful people who came and did good work.
Absolutely.
But there were some people who were not as wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not speaking of every single person. I'm just speaking of a kind of general, let's say, general effect. And this is something when the East German elites felt that they weren't asked for anymore. They weren't involved anymore, and they were driven out of their positions, not because of political reasons, but because they just had the wrong biography, or they just had whatever, the wrong background. This was something what I think was a kind of traumatizing experience for many. And this is something which you give on to the next generation. That's because you were asking, Stephen, what is it that 30 years later we still have this kind of effect that we have the separation, this kind of mental, cultural, political separation between East and West, which is not. I mean, it's not everywhere. I mean, it's not that we are a strongly separated country. So I don't want to exaggerate, but politically, of course, there are differences. It's being these experiences are being passed on to the next generation, are being told. This is are the narratives you mentioned, when people of our age or even younger, our kids who are teenies now, ask their grandparents, how was it in the East? What happened in the 90s to you? Yeah. And then they start telling their stories. And
you don't
that's what happens.
Sorry, you don't have
Go
to
ahead.
ask. Just about the story about Vladimir Balzer. She's also a journalist, and she wrote a book about Ostbewusstsein, it's called, so Ost consciousness.
Yeah.
And she's younger than Vladdy and me. She's never seen the GDR. She's born in 1989 and to study, I think, Munich. I think she went to Bavaria. I'm not sure, but she was always asked, tell me something about the East Germans. Why are you so different? I mean, she never seen the GDR, but she was asked as a young woman who's born in the United Germany, she should explain the East Germans. And that's, what Vladdy described, that it's passing in the next generation.
Yeah, so and it's getting even stronger. It's getting even stronger sometimes, because they are creating like myths. Actually, they're telling it even much more negative than it actually was. We all know that's a human thing, that your memory sometimes just tells you something different than it really was. So the story is getting stronger and stronger. And that's why this will linger on, actually, this whole aspect.
I mean, listening to both of you, it sounds a little bit like sort of the trauma of unification is being passed on, and this is contributing, very much to these kind of parallel societies that we talked about a little bit at the outset. That you've got, two mental images of what happened and of what's going on at the moment, and that's being perpetuated. I mean, I think many people thought it would take one generation for Germany to grow together, but it looks as if it will take much longer than that, and as if that is going to be even more difficult moving forward because of how these notions of the past have become embedded in the present. Is that sort of a fair way of thinking about it?
Yeah. But it's not the unification itself is not a trauma. This was what happened afterwards. I would definitely say that I'm sure the majority of East Germans are extremely happy about the unification. And only a few of them really want to have the GDR back.
Right.
That's just a tiny part, and that's not a serious level I would talk with people on. If you want to have the GDR back, that's not a discussion I want to have. We're speaking of the 90s, of everything after the unification.
Yeah, but let me sort of pick up on that point of what happened in the 90s, and move us a little bit more into the economic dimension, because it seems as if a lot was done to try to sort of lift the standard of living and reduce disparities in the East and between East and West. A lot of money was invested in building and modernizing infrastructure in the East, particularly in the area of transportation, energy, telecommunications. And one even sees it, in many of the cities, just the amount of renovation that took place. I mean, it was necessary, don't get me wrong, but a city like Leipzig has become really beautiful. And yet a city like Leipzig, in terms of its economy, is not nearly as strong as one might have expected of a city that size, when compared with other urban regions in Germany. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the economic dimension of unification and where there have been sort of lingering challenges in helping jumpstart the economy? Because I think that kind of contributes to a notion among people that that they've been passed over, that they've been disenfranchised.
I think we didn't talk about one point who is important to understand what happened. Millions of young people left East Germany after 1989. They went away because they didn't have any chance to get jobs. So it was a big bet. You're right. There were investments in buildings and in the cities, and but not in economics. There was big deindustrialization in East Germany. We didn't have any big players anymore. We don't have till today any DAX Unternehmen, DAX
companies.
DAX company in East Germany. And yes, it was there was a lot of money, and I know the standards, the economic standards are much higher than before, and I don't want to complain, but we've lost so much people, and they didn't come back. They never come back, and this big brain drain is difficult today. In Saxony, for instance, you've got much more men in middle and old age than women, and it's a problem. It's a problem because they really lost. They don't have jobs, and they don't have women, and that's one of the problems why we've got things like Pegida or this big Querdenker milieu.
Yeah, that's an important part. I think what Anja mentioned, that I mean the whole GDR East German industry was based on heavy industries,
right.
On steel plants, on whatever the oil industry, and this was actually the basis of the GDR economy.
Right.
And this, as Anja already mentioned, definitely was faced in the 90s with a global market, and they couldn't cope actually with this global market. They couldn't keep up with it. So they either had to close down, or they were shrinked into much more smaller companies. And it took years, even though there have been huge investment programs, state investment programs, it still didn't help really in the 90s, because the shock was so strong. This economical shock was so strong to the East German industry and to the general. I mean, we're speaking of a whole situation. The whole East broke off. I mean, the whole Eastern Europe changed, and suddenly you had this global market, and these sometimes even like ancient plans. Which were on the technical level of maybe the 50s or the 60s, were not ready for the situation, for the global market situation in the 90s. And this took years to recover. This took years, and it's still not really done. This is one of the main things, that we had this huge kind of working class in the east of Germany. They weren't really ready for new kind of industries and for maybe rethinking even their potentials and so on. That's why many went over to the West, and the East German, was a heavy, not only brain drain, but also like just people who they were not, they just left hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously understand the collapse of the economy in the GDR in the 90s and what sort of a lasting impact that has had. I don't want to, sort of explain that away, but it seems as if Eastern Germany today, is a place that's starting to attract some young and innovative companies and research organizations because the cost of living is lower. We just saw a major investment by Intel in Magdeburg to build new semiconductor plants. Tesla with its battery factory in Brandenburg. I mean, there are a couple of examples of modern, forward-looking technologies and industries and businesses coming to the East. And part of the reason why they're choosing places like the places that they're choosing is because of good universities. And so, it seems to me that
qualified people
coming out of those universities. And so we're starting to see a little bit of a shift, but that doesn't take away from the fact that there are, a number of people who feel left behind. And obviously that then also has political consequences, because we're seeing popularity of political parties on the extremes, both on the left and on the right. I'm thinking they're not just about the Linkspartei or left party, but Anja, you mentioned Pegida. On the right, of course, there's the AfD, but there are also splinter parties like the Free Saxons. How do you both explain the popularity of these populist parties? Is it just a protest against the status quo, or is there something more to it than that?
I think it's not only protest. There's more behind it, or it's beyond protest. It's also a difference between the cities you described, Stephen, because you've got Leipzig or Erfurt or Jena, which are kind of Dresden, which are kind of I think lighthouse cities, you say in Germany, Leuchtturmstädte, and the whole area around it is really different. It's different to live there. It's a different thinking, and maybe okay, Dresden is an exception, maybe, but the rest, it's a different thinking. It's more liberal and so on. But Saxony-Anhalt, for instance, is mostly a rural area. You've got 90% of the it's a rural area, and you've got Magdeburg, but then so what? There's nothing else anymore, but that's not the only reason, I think, why they are so completely lost in their minds. I don't know how to describe it. I understand the frustration, which has grown about the last years, for all the reasons we described. But I can't understand why they flee into right-wing ideas or right-wing parties. And it's more than protest. It's if you ask a sociologist, then some of them say it's some kind. If you don't have anything you can hold, if there's just a big hole, then the only thing you can find some hold is your nation.
I think so too. I mean, it's interesting that you're asking that these populist movements, like more from the right than from the left, I'd say, are managing kind of, I don't know, taking up on these feelings of not being heard, of not being heard by the it's difficult. I mean, it's actually difficult like to rationally analyze it, because it's a more kind of feeling, it's a kind of feeling of not being heard, of not being listened to, of not being understood. And I think we every time we're speaking about this, we have to remind ourselves about the history, and we also have to remind ourselves about the 90s. This experience, of being taken away something. Speaking of the current situation now, towards the Russian aggression and towards the whole energy crisis which we're having now, the sanctions. They have the feel. Many of them have the feeling. Okay, if energy prices, if gas prices are rising as heavily as they do, people in the East are much more affected, obviously, because they just have less money. They are economically not as strong, not as stable as in the West, and could kind of cope with the whole situation. And this feeling of, once again, even if the historical situation is totally different, of course, I mean, these sanctions are absolutely right in my position. They could be even stronger, but still, people have in the East this feeling of, okay, you are taking something away from us. You are taking our little wealth we were able to grow in the last couple of years, by these kind of sanctions towards Russia, concerning the war, which is far away from us. We have our own problems, don't make it more difficult than it needs to be. And this is something what these populist movements definitely profit from, this feeling.
But let me push you on this a little bit more, and you've sort of anticipated the direction that I wanted to go in, because you were talking about the right populist parties sort of picking up a little bit more on this feeling of not being heard. And yet we're also seeing a period right now of greater economic hardship, with rising costs for food, but also, of course, for gasoline, for electricity.
An inflation of 10% in the Eurozone.
Great concerns about heating costs this winter. And so as a result, this month, we've already seen sort of a little bit of a revival of those Monday demonstrations that we talked about a little bit earlier, that sort of started in September of 1989 with prayer meetings in Leipzig, and evolved into peaceful protests across the GDR that ultimately helped bring down the regime. And yet today, it's the far right and far left parties, beginning with the left party, which called for Monday demonstrations in Leipzig. And so I'd be interested in hearing you talk a little bit about sort of the impact of these demonstrations and their symbolism, because I think that's an important way of trying to get into the mindset in the East as well.
What do you think? I mean, there has been discussion going on for years now, because this Montagsdemonstration started actually off with the when they introduced Hartz IV, this unemployment program, and this has been, I don't know, help me out, 15 years ago or something.
Yeah,
almost. It's a very, very long time ago. When they took when these we had this for the first time. You had so-called Montagsdemonstration. They disappeared in the 90s and then came back after Hartz IV was introduced, and then they died out.
But they did die out after that, right? I mean, they haven't been around.
They did die out. They did die out, and it was still kind of, let's say, there weren't any kind of right-wing movements around which would have been as strong as the AfD or the Pegida is now. We're speaking of, I don't know, 2008, 2009, 2010. Speaking also of the global financial crisis, this all contributed to that situation. And now it's a bit different, because in those times, you didn't have this kind of nationalistic kind of approach. It was a more kind of social movement, and now it's different. It's more nationalistic. It's more towards kind of right-wing exclusion of I don't know, certain groups in society. It's a totally different thing, and I don't know. There's many East Germans are not really happy about a kind of that there are some political, let's say, movements who try to profit from this Montagsdemonstration tradition, you know. And I think so too. I think so too, because you can't really compare what was in '89 to that what is going on now.
Right.
So, yeah.
So thinking back about history, one of our viewers is curious about the decision at the time to convert East German marks to West German marks at a rate of 1-to-1, which has basically been viewed as a mistake. Would it have been better to come up with a different currency exchange? Would that have helped ease some of the situation, or would that actually have made things even more difficult?
I had long discussions about that with the Deutsche Bundesbank. It was interesting rounds, but yes, everyone knows that this kind of course was more symbolic. You did that for the East Germans, that they don't. I mean, there wasn't any. There wasn't a lot of money in the back. A lot of people till today, and it was clear if you would take a higher course, it would be much more difficult for the Germans. I mean, it was politically decision, not an economic. Like in this situation, a lot of political decisions were like this.
That's what many people say, that it was more a political decision during this monetary union but we're speaking of, I don't actually remember the amount. It was 1-to-1, but only
for
5,000,
limited,
something like 5,000 marks.
Yeah, there was an initial.
There was a cap. Right? Yeah. So you had many people moving money around on different accounts, you know, to have the maximum of this. This was the kind of challenge for many. I remember that. Yeah.
So I'd like to sort of come back to today, because, you know, one of the things that I think we're seeing playing out a little bit in the East that we haven't really talked about is a different relationship to Russia than the one that we see in West Germany. And also, I think it's fair to say a certain amount of skepticism regarding the United States that even borders on anti-Americanism in some places, not across the board, of course, but we see sort of different ties, different relationships. And one of our viewers submitted a question saying, as we look at Germany today, do you see different perspectives in foreign policy perceptions between the population in the East and the population in the West, particularly as it relates to places like Russia, but also as it relates to relations with China, or even more broadly, support for European integration and European unity? So I know that there's a lot there, but can you talk a little bit about sort of the relationship between the East and Russia, and how that sort of frames the foreign policy outlook of people in the eastern part of the country?
And when we both, Vladimir, you and me, when we're talking about the same, then we always ask what happened since February 24th, because it's difficult to understand why these Germans still now feel in a kind of close to Russia. It's really different to understand, but maybe there's some kind of really deeply rooted anti-Americanism. It's grown. I mean, the relationship to Russia was never easy. It was always ambivalent between um, citizens of the GDR and the Russian soldiers who were stationed. And it was not a really close or a friendly relationship, but it was really ambivalent. But we know them. I'd say we, but you know what you get, and maybe that's one of the points that if you over all the years, not only in the GDR but also in the years before, in East Germany, got to hear all what comes from America is bad, or is a kind of imperialistic. It means
I was always shocked. I was also shocked to see how deep this anti-Americanism is still rooted in East German society. I wouldn't have expected it to last that long. And once again, what we mentioned in the beginning of the talk, this is being passed on to the next generations, to many, and that's why I think that's the one point what Anja mentioned. I think this deeply rooted anti-Americanism in certain parts. We are not speaking. I mean, our whole talk is not speaking about entire East Germany, and East Germany is a very there's a huge variety of people, obviously. Not every East German has the same kind of mindset, but like generally speaking about this phenomenon.
And there are some trends, right? There are some trends.
There are some trends. Especially with the elder people. I can notice that with the generation of my parents, who, yes, of course, oppose the war, oppose this Russian aggression, but still, every time we talk about this, trying to remind me of wars which were led by America. And I say, let's just talk about this. We don't have to compare here anything, but this is what they always try, to kind of remind me of, the history of wars, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, you name it. So they have the feeling maybe there is this kind of Russia. It's a strange place, but still it stands up to the United States. It kind of defies. This is one point, I think. Another thing is this ambivalent relationship to Russia. There was it was obligatory in East German schools to learn the Russian language. But if you would ask somebody with East German biography if they actually learned any Russian, they would deny it, because it was such a political thing to learn this language that kids actually in their minds were not ready for really learning this language, and we didn't have any exchange with like normal Russians. But still there was this solidarity maybe of understanding, especially the Russian soldiers. They were regarded as victims, because they weren't treated really well by their officers, and they didn't have very nice. Absolutely, they were treated really badly, in their military structures in East Germany. So there was this solidarity of, we know how you feel, how in what bad situation you are.
So I'd like to maybe close with two very different viewer questions, but that raise some interesting points and maybe put some of what you're talking about in context. One of our viewers points out that obviously in the German case, there were great similarities in terms of language, culture, religion, and German unification was funded generously by the West to make this happen. And yet, as we've been talking about today, some of the results have not been as positive as many people would have hoped or might have expected. As we think about possible future enlargements of the European Union, are there any lessons that we can learn from the German experience that might be helpful when considering who one might bring into the EU? Yeah, I mean, Vladimir, do you want to start and see?
Okay. It's difficult to compare, I suppose. It's difficult to compare. When we are speaking of places like North Macedonia or Albania, which want to join the European Union, so this is for many East Germans just a very abstract thing. It's just too far away, and I'm so sure. I actually consider the European Union as a kind of network of countries with different cultures and different kind of societies, and just a core of human rights, of the rule of law. All of this is important, but there is no such thing as a kind of common culture or something. What we had between East and West, we had the same language. We have the same language. We have the same history, which we share. Everything before 45. We had family ties, and so on. That's why it's difficult to compare, I suppose. And I remember, I don't know, Anja, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember any kind of doubts about the expansion of the European Union towards the East in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I don't remember that East Germans, wouldn't have been happy about Poland or Slovakia or Bulgaria joining it. Do you remember any?
No.
It was okay for them. It actually was a good thing. Yeah. They knew these places. They knew these places. They knew these places better than the West Germans. So
it was familiar for them. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there were some aspects of, let's say, political experience, which maybe some East Germans shared with Bulgarian people, with Polish people. They could share something. They could understand each other in certain aspects, maybe sometimes better than East and West Germans. Yeah, because this common experience, political experience.
Anja, I don't know. Do you want to add anything to that?
Maybe something else. East Germany has gone through the transformation at 500 miles per hour. That's what Vladi described. It was a short time and a really big. It was a completely new landscape for the whole people there. We are now again in a big transformation process. We see it. And it started before 24th of February, but 24th of February was a turning point. And now I think things we're gonna go faster than before, even faster than before. And I think one of the big points we have to watch are the people. Can you take them, the people who are not like Vladi and me, who are able to go with this transformation, but the people who are not able because they poor or they socially disrupted in some ways. I think that's what. And at one point in this big complex we see now the Bundesregierung is doing to take millions and billions of euros to help people to get through this crisis. It's important, but you have to find another kind of communication about what this transformation means. And that means not transformation just for Germany, but for the whole Europe. And I don't know if you see or if you look to Italy, or maybe France next. We don't find this story to tell why Europe is so important. Maybe we lose them. Maybe we lose this project.
So Anja, I'm glad that you brought up Italy, because it's a perfect segue to the last question that I want to pose to you, which comes from one of our viewers, and I think is really sort of a very interesting question for us all to be thinking about. the viewer writes, in the United States, there's a growing split between the right and the left, where the left feels more aligned to the Davos globalists, and the right feels more as if it's being pushed down, which is similar to what you're describing of the emotion of people living in the former East Germany. And the viewer goes on to say, considering the recent elections in Italy, there seems to be a growing movement against the global elites. Do you think this is the case? And is some of what you're describing about the East Germans sort of apparent in that perception?
Well, big question.
It is a big question.
I'm not sure if there is such thing as the global elites. I'm afraid that's not. I don't know. I'm not sure if this is the wording I would use, because it kind of implies that there is a group of people who kind of, I don't know, who have the power, and a little tiny group of people who has the power, and all the others are just the victims and have to follow. I'm not sure if that is right. I'm actually sure it's not right. But one thing which important is what Anja said, that you have to, especially speaking of East Germans, they are people mainly who speak out, and you can be frank with them. You can be really open to them, and that's what they expect. There are people who don't want to be, don't want to be deceived, but don't want to have. They don't like illusions. They don't like metaphors. They are pretty straight people, down to earth people. That's how I see them, politically at least. And if you speak to them openly and tell them about the challenges and the problems which are ahead of us, which are not over. I mean, this war is not over. The sanctions are not over. The energy crisis is far from over. It will be a tough winter probably. But if you speak to them openly, that there is a crisis, there is a situation where we have to kind of work together and trying to solve the whole thing. This is really important, not to do as if there's nothing really, there's no big thing going on. There's a lot of things going on, and that's what East Germans expect. I think even a little bit more than West Germans, that they are talked to openly, and they expect a lot. They expect a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's this so-called Mitte-Studie. I can just talk about what happens in Germany. I think I'm not. I don't dare to talk about a global thing, but 70% of the people who were asked in this Mitte-Studie how they stand for democracy, politics, and so on. And 70% of the respondents believe that they have no influence on the actions of politicians. And 62% think that politicians do not care about the common good. So, and this is an alarming point on a practical democratic point of view, because on the one hand, that people who feel powerless or without influence are more inclined to extreme right-wing or conspiracy ideological thinking. And on the other hand, this driving trust in politics leads some to hate and violent ideas towards politicians. So, and that's the situation that we are. And as I said, we need a positive narrative why democracy is not easy. And yes, it is complex, but it's the best of all bad political systems, Churchill said. And I don't know, I'm not a politician, but I don't know how to do that. But you see some politicians in a new way to communicate. I try to say it as neutral as I can.
Yeah.
I mean, Vladimir and I have had a chance to talk about this a little bit a few weeks ago, but I mean, I think it comes back to a topic that we could spend a whole hour on, if not longer, talking about communication by politicians and making clear why certain policies are introduced, why certain choices are made, why certain decisions are made, and that often the political elite is not making the case to the public that it needs to be making. You know, we have seen this a little bit in the 90s, as we were talking about. In Eastern Germany, we've seen it a little bit since then. And obviously we see it today with the multiple crises, right? I mean, as we come out from the pandemic, with the war, with the energy crisis, with real concerns about what the fall will be, I think people are in agreement that this is going to be the winter of discontent, but does it become the winter of rage? And that's something that we'll have to see. For now, though, I'd like to thank both of you for making the time to reflect a little bit on more than 30 years of unification in Germany, and some of the difficulties and differences that continue to exist. I'd like to wish you, Anja, a gute Fahrt, and both of you a wonderful long weekend, and hope that we have a chance to continue the conversation again sometime in the future, maybe not before this time next year, when we're thinking about 33 years since German unification. But for now, herzlichen Dank to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure.